And this is how we've been doing it for 2 years, folks. This is also our 2-year anniversary of the Pleasure of the Text podcast. We're winging it every time.
Winging it every time. That's it. Actually, it is. So it's been 2 years now.
It's been 2 years.
Man, that's incredible. You know, I saw a video the other day, or yesterday, in fact, and it was Trump, Donald Trump, and a bunch of cats dancing. It was all about, eating cats. And it had been out for like 6 hours and it had 2.6 million views. And I'm just thinking, do we need a little more dancing cat action in our podcast just to swell the numbers a little bit? Because I could get my girls in here and just get them doing the cha-cha.
And by girls, you mean cats, everyone, just FYI. Yeah.
Sound like a kitty pimp. Yes, I did mean that. Yeah, my furry ladies.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pleasure of the Text, a shared and management space where readers and writers make meaning together. We're your hosts, Shannon and Gareth.
Good morning, Shannon. How are you going?
Really good. And yourself, Gareth?
Yeah, I'm basking in the warm glow of the morning. A soft yellow light. How's the light at your end of things? It sort of has a bluish, icy tinge.
Yes, I currently do feel like the Ice Queen on my end. It is a little bit cold. But beyond that, this is going to be a warm conversation.
Yes, it is. Because we're talking about something I'm very excited about, which is translation. As a broad concept, I think we have touched on translation an enormous number of times in this podcast. It just keeps coming up in one form or another, in translated forms, in fact. So we're going to dedicate an actual discussion to it, which I'm very excited about.
I was reading through some of our notes and your notes on this, and I did notice you've got our translated. Can you remember the name of the podcast that it was in relation to? But Lady Anne's Taciturnity, and we translated that. Oh, that was to do with restrictions in writing.
Yeah, it was in the sense that it's a lipogram where we exorcised the letter E from the text, and it was the original story was the reticence of Lady Anne, and we changed it to Lady Anne's Taciturnity, which was fun. I don't imagine we'll spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's another form of translation. I thought it'd be interesting just to kind of do a refresher on some of the times we've talked about translation. So there's a few of those and a few new texts. And I also want to do some translation comparisons, but I learned from the Solaris podcast that there is such a thing as overdoing it. So I've done a very, a very truncated form of that, which I feel is streamlined and economical. And, like our podcast, which there's no fat on this bone. So, yeah, yeah. So how do we begin this process? What should we talk about first, do you think?
Well, I did mention before we pressed the record button that your vigour and excitement for this topic far exceeds my own. So I was hoping that you would lead. But before you do, I am halfway through reading Cruddy, which was a book recommendation by our favourite listener. And I am loving it. If you've not got yourself a copy, go get yourself a copy so you can join us on our next fortnight's podcast where we will be reviewing Cruddy. It's incredible. Love it. It's sitting at a 5-star for me already, but Again, we'll see how it ends.
Goodness me. I haven't started reading it because I've been doing copious amounts of reading for my creative writing course, which will be up sometime next year. And
can you tell us a bit more
my
on
eyes
that,
are
Gareth?
bleeding. Well, I mean, what's to say? It's going to be a creative writing course. What I want to do is sort of plug a hole that exists in writing courses, which is around the idea of intertextuality, which is a very key idea in writing and the way one would approach the process of writing. I think it's always really missing in courses, and so people sort of come away from a course not entirely knowing what to do next. So I want to make sure that's not a problem for people doing my course, which, is as yet unnamed and barely formed. It's in a fetal stage at the moment, the course, but I'm doing the rather onerous reading stage where, one assumes they know everything, but what you find is when you read enough books and articles, and I think I've read about 30 books so far, usually one a day, which is why I haven't started cruddy. A lot of it is stuff but there'll always be something and you think, oh yeah, I should mention that. So going through that process, but it's shaping up well, and I'm feeling pretty good about it, actually.
All I can say is I haven't had any formal course training from you, but I've learned a lot just from our interactions, and I would say you're my mentor in terms of my writing. So I think this course is going to be great, and I'm really looking forward to it. And it's going to add so much value to so many people.
Well, I hope so. That's certainly what I'm hoping for. But I assume, because I'll do a test run, I assume you'll be in the test run so you can let people know. And we'll just be honest about it. If it's a great big turkey, you can say, and I'll just do some serious revisions. So, yeah. But yeah, that's been taking up quite a lot of my reading space. But I'm going to have to put aside a block of time and really get into cruddy, which I'm looking forward to because you've already sort of tested it and it's like, yeah, it's good. So don't have to worry. But in any case.
And I'm assuming...
Yes?
Well, in any case, yeah, I'm assuming your course is going to talk or at least touch on translation in a sense.
Yes, yeah, it is. Although probably the word translation won't come up. But translation is an idea that can exist in writing in so many different ways. I've got at the top of my notes that writing by its nature is an act of translation. So obviously, when we're talking about that, we're talking about the way we translate ideas and emotions and experiences into words, which are, representations of those things. They're not the things themselves. But obviously, we want to translate these experiences. So, when you're reading cruddy, you're experiencing it. You're experiencing perhaps what the protagonist is experiencing, to create that sort of reading imaginative world. And so there is an act of translation from the writer to the text, from the text to the reader, and from the reader to the text. Because, of course, we bring our own experiences, and that very much shapes what our reading world looks like. So translation is really fundamental. And, of course, Shannon, we've been looking at lots of different writers, and occasionally I'll sort of say, who you should read for this thing? You should read this person. And influences, the way we translate our influences, is also an act of translation, the way we appropriate and, misread, as Harold Bloom would say. All of these things, none of it exists in a bubble. And so intertextuality, that idea that texts are connected to each other and that their edges are not that easy to define, that's very much tied in with this idea of translation. So obviously we are talking about translating texts from one language to another, but there's a sort of a broader scope to it as well. And and I think it's just been very interesting when I think about our discussions over the past couple of years. Translation has actually come up quite a bit. So I did have a glance at your notes, but, I'm a great believer in winging it. Probably because I don't do the editing.
And this is how we've been doing it for 2 years, folks. This is also our 2-year anniversary of the Pleasure of the Text podcast. We're winging it every time.
Winging it every time. That's it. Actually, it is. So it's been 2 years now.
It's been 2 years.
Man, that's incredible. You know, I saw a video the other day, or yesterday, in fact, and it was Donald Trump, and a bunch of cats dancing. And it was all about, eating cats. And it had been out for like 6 hours, and it had 2.6 million views. And I'm just thinking, do we need a little more dancing cat action in our podcast just to swell the numbers a little bit? Because I could get my girls in here and just get them doing the cha-cha.
And by girls, you mean cats, everyone, just FYI. Yeah.
Sound like a kitty pimp. Yes, I did mean that. Yeah, my furry ladies.
Oh, no, just stop, go. Yes, translation. To my notes, one of the things that I found really interesting, and I would love you to talk to the point, Gareth, was this concept of something being lost and then gained in translation. There was a famous person. I actually used ChatGPT to kind of help me consolidate some of this information on translation. And there is a guy called George Steiner who wrote extensively on the theory of translation with his famous work on the subject in his book After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation in 1975. And he brought up this concept for me that something is always lost in translation, but then there's something gained. And then he has this famous quote, "Every language is a veil over a much deeper silence." And he kind of went deeper just of translation, but also the fact of us communicating, even in our own mother tongue English, we are always mistranslating each other and misunderstanding. And language is never true to the exact thoughts inside of us. There's always something missing in that step.
Yeah, well, there is, because it's a representation. And it's often one that's gone through drafts. Drafts, again, a kind of translation. You write your first draft, and it might, in fact, be the closest version you'll ever have of what was more or less in your head. But nevertheless, even, you can't transcribe everything that's going on in there, the sort of flow of images and thoughts and feelings. It's too fast, too complex. So we pick a stream, and that stream implies everything that is left unsaid. So there's a really lovely quote from A Lover's Discourse, which we did some time ago by Roland Barthes, and he talks about the line, "I'm thinking of you." We say that to the people we love, "I'm thinking of you." But the implication of that is that at every other time, I'm not thinking of you, I've forgotten you. The very notion of saying "I'm thinking of you" suggests all those other times. And I think that's what's lost, both when you start to write and indeed when you start to communicate, just talking to someone, you start making choices between all these possibilities that are alive until the moment you make a choice. And then obviously in translation, it's somebody's reading and they're picking up certain sort of semantic aspects of a text, and necessarily others will go missing. There's an excellent example of that in, I've got some pieces of Camus' The Outsider.
So what's his background then?
He's Algerian. He was a Frenchman, but of Algerian descent. Camus is famous as sort of the father of absurdism. And certainly when I was a young man, Camus was my absolute favorite writer. Perhaps, in fact, if I'd come to him later, he might be my favorite writer now. He's an amazing writer, I think. But obviously, familiarity breeds contempt. But he did a fascinating thing. He wrote this novel called A Happy Death. I can't remember. He worked on it for a very long time. Yeah, he worked on it from 1936 to
over 11 years.
No, that was how long it took to get published. It was published 11 years after his death. I think he died in 1960 in a car accident. But he worked on this novel for 3 years, between 1936 and 1938. And the way Camus worked was that he would just write copious amounts very quickly. And then he would spend years editing it down into the tiny little books that he would publish. But he worked on this book, A Happy Death, and then he abandoned it. And then he worked on, his most famous work, The Outsider, which was published in 1942. But what's interesting about it is that The Outsider, to my mind in any case, is a reworking, a translation of A Happy Death. And the differences between them are a masterclass, again, to my mind, in creative choices. A Happy Death is a really good book. If I'd written A Happy Death, I'd be thrilled. Nailed it, entering the canon. The Outsider is a great book, in my opinion. It's one of the great books of the 20th century. And evidently he felt he had this in him, and evidently he felt A Happy Death was not going to get there. And so he reworked it quite dramatically into this other book. But he also consciously wrote in an American style. So very simple, active language. Not a lot of passive sentences.
So how does that differ from the French style?
I think what he was more... So he was influenced by cinema. And Camus, if you see pictures of Camus, he looks like he's in a film in every picture. He looks like he's a private detective. He's got his trench coat on. He's smoking a cigarette. You just think, yeah, that's right. That's Camus, the world famous French film noir detective. So I think he was very influenced by that. I don't know French well enough to really understand if for a French reader what the difference would be. But certainly in terms of translations, his first two translators were British, and they gave the book a British feel. The first of his translators, Stuart Gilbert, who translated The Outsider in 1946, his book it's like talking to an old schoolmaster, don't you know, sort of stuff. And the sentences are incredibly blown out. So the whole tone is radically altered. And so what's interesting is to compare British translations to American translations, because The Outsider has been translated 5 times since 1942 into English, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and you were saying there's quite significant differences between the English, the British, and the American?
Oh, yeah, no, there is. I'll give you a quick rundown of the history of The Outsider. Now, I've been sort of dancing around this so the original book by Camus is called L'Étranger, something like that. L'Étranger. It looks like you can see the word stranger in it. And so when they were translating it into English, the question was, should we call it The Stranger? Should we not call it The Stranger? The Outsider is probably more correct because L'Étranger has a number of meanings. And The Outsider kind of works to encapsulate all those meanings. So there's always been an argument about what the book should be called, but I personally think The Outsider makes sense in English. So there were a bunch of different translators of this book. So Stuart Gilbert was the first guy in 1946. He was friends with James Joyce. He was quite the literary don, very esteemed. And his version is very sort of upper middle class British. The main character, Mousseau, sort of takes on this, very kind of tweedy sort of character under Gilbert. I hadn't previously read Gilbert, so my translation, the one I grew up with, was Joseph Laredo's translation. He did one in 1982. So that's like 35 years, something like that, where there'd just been the one translation. So Laredo is also British, and his book is sort of a bit Britishy, but in a much more colloquial way. So I think it's a fairly large step towards the original. The same year, 1982, a lady called Kate Griffith, who I know almost nothing about. I think she was either a student or a teacher. She was a teacher. She, with 3 of her students, translated the book.
Interesting.
Couldn't get my hands on a copy of that in time. Apparently, it is a bit of a train wreck. Lots of spelling errors and all kinds of sort of problems and misunderstandings of translation. So I would love to have a copy of that, but it'll just have to wait. So when I do a very succinct comparison of different translations, and hers is not in there because I just couldn't get my hands on it. 6 years later, Matthew Ward, American translator, quite a renowned translator. He translated the book and gave it an American reading, I guess, which people at the time said was much, much closer to what it would have been like to read the original in French. And then there was quite a long gap, and then in 2012, Sandra Smith did another translation. And this one, I mean, she sort of makes the argument that the translations date, and so it is actually necessary to do them. I have a little quote from her, in fact. She says, "Readers may wonder why a new translation of The Outsider is necessary. Primarily, it is essential to create new versions of classic works in another language because language constantly evolves. The original text is immutable, yet translations should be written in a style that is accessible to the modern reader while conveying the spirit of the original text." So yeah, I think that's...
Doesn't that smack a lot of someone like the publisher's Penguin making changes to Roald Dahl's books?
No, I don't think so, because actually the Laredo version did have a change made to it, one word, which was very controversial, because back in those days, people had some sense of respect. This is those kinds of edits where you're basically ripping a piece apart to make it acceptable. I think that is very unfaithful, very lacking in fidelity. This is doing another translation it stands or falls on its own merits, and it's not claiming to be the original text. It's always claiming to be a translation. So I think that's kind of okay. She also actually talks about l'étranger could be translated as outsider, stranger, or foreigner. So you can see how calling the book The Stranger in English is not quite right. It certainly doesn't capture the foreigner. So, yeah. Really interesting stuff. Matthew Ward, likewise, has a rather interesting thing. He says, he's quoting Richard Howard. Richard Howard, by the way, was a big translator of Roland Barthes. So I've read quite a lot of Richard Howard translations. And Ward says, as Richard Howard pointed out in his classic statement on retranslation, in his prefatory note to The Immoralist, time reveals all translation to be paraphrase. All translations date. Certain works do not. So I thought that was very interesting. So that's why we have 5 translations, that and the fact that none of them have quite nailed it.
Yeah.
Now, what I did, because I wanted to join this race, I also did a translation of L'Étranger using Google Translate.
Did you? You didn't
I
tell
did.
me that.
I thought, let's do it and see how it comes up. Would it actually be any good? And I have to say to, the folks at Google, I doffed my cap. The translation, as far as I can tell, is actually pretty darn good. Because obviously I can't compare it to the French because my French is poor, but I compared it to the English translations and also the criticisms of those translations. And curiously enough, Google Translate sidesteps almost all the criticisms and produces quite a faithful text.
Incredible. Okay.
Yeah. So Google, if you want to throw some money at the Pleasure of the Text podcast, now would be the time.
I'm assuming you've got to read your Google Translate.
Well, I've only got passages of it, but what I'm going to read to you, the basic passages, are the Google Translate passages. I didn't want to give any of the other translations, sort of unfair advantages. I will say I am a big fan of the Laredo version. It's because it was my first. He was my first, and I've just grown up with it, and I've quoted bits of it throughout my life, and I'm going to deal with one of those too. And so, I can see that it has flaws, but for me, it's a sort of a sentimental favorite. I think it just, broadly speaking, the Stuart Gilbert, it won the 1946 one, is missable. It's not worth doing. The Kate Griffith apparently is terrible, but that could be fun. I think the Laredo, the Matthew Ward, and the Sandra Smith translations are all worthy translations. They're all interesting to read. But you could probably, with due respect to Professor Gilbert, who is no longer with us, I don't think he did a very good translation. Just before we jump into these texts, because I'm going to be fascinated to see what you think of all this. There's an interesting article in I think it was the New Yorker by a fellow called Ryan Bloom, and he talks about the first line of L'Étranger, and basically it should be today Mammon died. So we have this problem, which is the French word mammon is not mother. It's not mummy. It's probably closest to mum or maybe mama. Mama might even be edging in the wrong direction. It's affectionate, but it's not childlike. And so that first sentence, which is one of the most famous sentences in literature, has been rendered in a number of different ways. But the key problem is what do you do with the French word maman? And what do you do with the placement of the word today? And so I'm not going to read any of this article out. I just wanted it in front of me so I didn't forget. But essentially, what Ryan Bloom talks about is the fact that all of these translators struggled with that first sentence. And indeed, Ward and Smith talk a lot in their translated notes on how they rendered the very first sentence, which is only a few words, and trying to get the emphasis right, because what is fascinating about The Outsider is that the whole book is a reflection of that first sentence. You get that wrong and the whole book skews. So it's incredibly important. And so, he has some pretty interesting thoughts about it. Actually, no, I might just read you the last bit. So he sort of says, so basically, when he wrote this, Ryan Bloom, the Sandra Smith translation had not yet come out. It came out in the same year as this article was written. So he's talking about the Ward translation. He feels Ward gets it right because Ward just keeps the word mammon. He doesn't try and translate it. Which is, not a bad idea. So let me read you this. Bloom writes, so if Matthew Ward finally corrected the mother problem, what exactly has he and the other translators gotten wrong? The linguistic fluency of any good translator tells them that syntactically, oh God, aujourd'hui maman est morte. That was terrible. It's not the most fluid English sentence. So rather than the more literal translation, today mother has died, we get mother died today, which is a smoother, more natural rendering in English. But rendering the line as mother died today completely neglects the specific ordering of ideas that offer insight into Mousseau's inner psyche. Throughout the course of the novel, the reader comes to see that Mousseau is a character who, first and foremost, lives for the moment. He does not consciously dwell on the past. He does not worry about the future. What matters is today. The single most important factor of his being is right now. And so, yes, starting the book with the word today is incredibly important because, in a sense, what you're getting is today, this is Mousseau's state of being. Mother died. This is the thing that disturbs the state of being. And it's a really important thing. So, getting to the translations. This took me a whole day to do, so it won't take a whole day to read. So just consider that if you're about to turn off. So I've got 4 extracts. These are all from the Google Translate version. And keep in mind, I've read all the other versions, so I'm confident that the Google Translate is not bad. I don't think you'll find it a disaster. So this is extract number 1, and it's the very beginning of the book. Today, Mother died, or maybe yesterday, I don't know. I received a telegram from the asylum. Quote, Mother deceased, burial tomorrow, kind regards, end quote. That doesn't mean anything. It could have been yesterday. The old people's home is in Marengo, 80 kilometers from Algiers. I'll take the bus at 2 o'clock and I'll arrive in the afternoon. That way I'll be able to stay up and I'll go home tomorrow evening. I asked my boss for 2 days off and he couldn't refuse me with an excuse like that, but he didn't seem happy. I even told him it's not my fault. He didn't answer. I thought then that I shouldn't have told him that. In short, I didn't have to apologize. It was up to him to offer me his condolences. But he will probably do it the day after tomorrow when he sees me in mourning. For the moment, it's a bit as if Mum had not died. After the funeral, on the contrary, it will be a closed case and everything will have taken on a more official air. So that's the beginning of the novel as rendered by Google Translate. And I think it's tremendously close to what everyone else does in broad brushstrokes. What I think is really interesting about that passage, there's a few things. The first line, today Mother died. So Google Translate gets the syntax correct, puts day at the front. And the other thing that I think is interesting is the choice of the word asylum.
Yeah, I was going to point out the word asylum because every other one says home.
Yeah. And I guess, funeral homes in the 1940s were not great. I mean, I guess arguably they're not great now, but I think they were less great. And I wonder if asylum isn't in some ways, it's clearly not correct. Like if you were doing a translation, you wouldn't use asylum. But I think perhaps I would say nursing home, just to get across the idea that it's not great. As opposed to, old people's home, which isn't necessarily the same thing. It's sort of a retirement community. So I think asylum kind of at least highlights that. The other thing that I think is interesting is the second paragraph ends with, for the moment, it's a bit as if Mum had not died. And he's talking about his boss, but I think he's also talking about himself, Mousseau. I think for him, his mother hasn't quite died yet in his mind. And the fact that he doesn't know which day she died on, because the telegram isn't clear, I think is another point where we have this sort of indecision. And so he says, after the funeral, on the contrary, it will be a closed case and everything will have taken on a more official air. It's almost as if until that happens, he doesn't feel he can think that she's dead. And I think that's a really interesting thing. I remember the first time I read that in the Laredo version, I was really struck by the sense of disconnection in the book. So now here are the other translators. I'm not going to read out the whole passage. I'm just picking out their choices. So Stuart Gilbert, he went with Mother died today. Joseph Laredo also went with Mother Died Today. Matthew Ward, of course, did Mummin Died Today. And Sandra Smith went for My Mother Died Today. Now, she actually talks about this, and she says that she chose My Mother because there is something, I guess, very official and shocking about the formality in that instance. That was her decision. Otherwise, she uses Mama, M-A-M-A.
Yeah, I was going to point that out because the next line I'm assuming you're going to read out, she's switched back to Mama, which I actually quite like.
Yeah, I think it's not a bad choice, right? So they all refer to the asylum as the home, except for Sandra Smith, who said the old people's home. And I think that is actually also a better choice because, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Stuart Gilbert weirdly capitalizes home as though it's, the home. And that's what they call it. Which one? Oh, the home. Yeah. Now, that sort of... And the other thing they don't do, which I think is interesting, is there is a paragraph break. For the moment, it's a bit as if Mum had not died. Paragraph break. And then you have a one-sentence paragraph about after the funeral. Now, typically, that kind of point of emphasis is meaningful. Every single translator ignores that and takes away some of the power of what is being said there and the implied importance of it. So Stuart Gilbert in that sentence says, for the present, it's almost as if Mother weren't really dead. The funeral will bring it home to me, put an official seal on it, so to speak. Old chap.
Oh, that's very old-fashioned English.
Yeah, the language is bad, although the funeral will bring it home to me, I think, is conveying the point. But I wonder if it lacks subtlety. But he's certainly, getting the point across that it's actually also about Masoda's not really getting that his mother is dead. Now, the Laredo version is, for the moment, it's almost as if Mother was still alive. After the funeral, though, the death will be a classified fact, and the whole thing will have assumed a more official aura. Now, being honest here, I can see that that's not a great translation. It has a certain wonkiness about it. Matthew Ward, the celebrated Matthew Ward, went for now. It's almost as if Mammon weren't dead. After the funeral, though, the case will be closed and everything will have a more official feel to it. And finally, Sandra Smith, for now, it's still a little as if Mama hadn't died. After the funeral, however, it will be over and done with, a matter that is officially closed. That, I think, is really interesting translation because it highlights the time. This theme
and
of
it just
the day.
sounds more smoother and lyrical.
Yeah, it's a good translation, that, I think. And this whole concept, there are sort of, there's today, and if you think of that as Maso's essential nature, this living in the present, the concept of the day is very important, and disruptions in the day. And then there's the concept of happiness. And it's worth noting that this book, L'Étranger, was written at the same time as Camus' other very famous book, a collection of essays called The Myth of Sisyphus. And in The Myth of Sisyphus, it talks about the character of Sisyphus who rolls the boulder up the hill and describes him as the absurd man. We'll talk about this a bit later, but at the end of the essay, he says we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And so these are important things. So today and happiness, that's the key. So that's extract number one. These translators powered their way through it. Extract number two is a piece that I've always used in my writing classes. No one else is drawing attention to this. This is not considered an important passage of the book, but for me, it's always been incredibly important. And it's a fascinating, emotionally, it's a fascinating piece, the way it moves back and forth. So the context is Maso has gone to the beach to swim, and he's run into a lady he kind of fancies called Marie. So now this is the Google Translate version. When the sun became too strong, she dove in and I followed her. I caught up with her, put my hand around her waist, and we swam together. She was still laughing. On the dock while we were drying ourselves, she said to me, "I'm darker than you." I asked her if she wanted to come to the cinema that evening. She laughed again and told me she wanted to see a film with Fernando. When we got dressed, she seemed very surprised to see me in a black tie and asked if I was in mourning. I told her that Mum had died. When she wanted to know how long ago, I replied, "Since yesterday." She flinched a little, but didn't comment. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't my fault, but I stopped myself because I thought I had already told my boss. It didn't mean anything. Anyway, we're always a little bit at fault. So, what do you think of that passage?
I'm just going back in the past and remembering reading that passage, and it's not much later after that until the awful scene happens. It's a really beautiful scene. And I've jumped ahead and read all the other versions, and I still can't decide which is my favourite line.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've always found that. I've quoted that, the specific rendering that Laredo does, which is "you're always partly to blame." I think that's a very good philosophy to have in life. It avoids the sense of victimhood. I mean, everything that's ever happened to me in my life, good and bad, I've always been partly to blame for it. And I very much see that. And I've quoted that just to friends and family and as a little piece of wisdom that I've picked up in life. And I got it from the Joseph Laredo translation of The Outsider. But probably the most literal rendering as done by Google Translate is, "Anyway, we're always a little bit at fault." Pretty similar. And again, we have a paragraph break. That sentence is one paragraph. It's important. And once again, none of the translators respect that. It's all part of a larger paragraph for them. So let me give you the different versions. The Gilbert. I was just going to explain to her that it wasn't my fault, but I checked myself, as I remembered having said the same thing to my employer and realizing then that it sounded foolish. Still, foolish or not, somehow one can't help feeling a bit guilty, I suppose.
That's Gilbert.
Yeah, it's wordy, and it misses the point. It's not about feeling guilty. It's about knowing you're guilty. So, in fact, he's pretty radically changed the meaning of it.
Yeah.
The Laredo. I felt like telling her that it wasn't my fault, but I stopped myself because I remembered that I'd already said that to my boss. It didn't mean anything. In any case, you're always partly to blame. So I have a very affectionate attachment to that. What do you think? I assume you'd pick that over the Gilbert so far?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Do you think it makes any material difference? We're always a little bit at fault. You're always partly to blame. Do you think there's a meaningful difference between those renderings?
There is quite a significant difference in the word fault and blame. I know if you were to use the thesaurus, it would be similar, but I feel blame is weightier.
Yeah, it possibly is. Yeah, I can see that. That's interesting. And I guess partly is bigger than little bit. Yeah, interesting. Time for the Matthew Ward. I felt like telling her it wasn't my fault, but I stopped myself because I remembered that I'd already said that to my boss. It didn't mean anything. Besides, you always feel a little guilty.
And I feel like in this one, the word "feel" kind of separates it again.
I think it's a miss for me.
Yeah.
And finally, Sandra Smith. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't my fault, but I stopped myself because I remembered I'd already said that to my boss. That doesn't mean anything. Although actually, everyone is always a little guilty.
I like her structure of the sentence, but I don't like the word guilty.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I think for me the Laredo's the best one. If we're not going off the straight translation, it's really weird, isn't it? Using Google Translate as the authority, but it kind of works. So we're up to
Yeah.
extract number 3. This is a crucial scene, and I probably should have said earlier, folks, we're doing some spoilers here. So
As always.
all right. This is extract 3. This is a little bit longer, but it's kind of important. This is the scene where Mousseau kills the Arab on the beach.
Which is the next day after he's just gone to dinner with Marie, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very soon after. The whole book, more or less. Well, I guess between parts 1 and 2, there's a bit of a gap, but essentially they're little snapshots of time on either end. What is amazing about this is the idea that Mousseau is not driving anything that happens. He walks up to a guy and shoots him. That's what actually happens. But the way this is conveyed, I think, is really interesting. So here we go. It was the same sun as the day I had buried my mother. Now that's an important line. I should just stop myself. It was the same sun as the day I buried my mother. The sun on that day was hot, and it bothered him. And this, just keep in mind the idea of today and his happiness within the space of today. It was the same sun as the day I'd buried my mother, and as then my forehead especially hurt, and all its veins were beating together under the skin. Because of this burning that I could no longer bear, I made a move forward. I knew it was stupid, that I would not get rid of the sun by moving one step, but I took a step, just one step forward. And this time, without getting up, the Arab drew his knife and presented it to me in the sun. The light flashed on the steel, and it was like a long, sparkling blade that struck me in the forehead. At the same moment, the sweat gathered in my eyebrows, suddenly ran down to my eyelids and covered them with a warm, thick veil. My eyes were blinded behind this curtain of tears and salt. I felt nothing but the symbols of the sun on my forehead, and indistinctly the glaring sword springing from the knife still in front of me. This burning sword gnawed at my eyelashes and searched my painful eyes. That's when everything wavered. The sea carried a thick, fiery breath. It seemed to me that the sky was opening up in all its expanse to rain down fire. My whole being tensed, and I tightened my grip on the revolver. The trigger gave way. I touched the polished belly of the butt, and it was there, in the noise that was both dry and deafening, that it all began. I shook off the sweat and the sun. I understood that I had destroyed the balance of the day, the exceptional silence of a beach where I had been happy. So I fired 4 more times at an inert body where the bullet sank without it showing, and it was like 4 short knocks that I was knocking on the door of misfortune. Now, I don't know that Google entirely nailed that, but it's not a bad effort for an algorithm.
Yes, and this time I haven't cheated and gone forward. So far, without any comparisons, I kind of like this line. I understand that I had destroyed the balance of the day, the exceptional silence of a beach where I'd been happy. That line seems quite powerful to me.
It's very powerful because we bring in these 2 ideas, today, the day, and happiness. And what when he says happiness, he's not talking about, ha, 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 I'm happy. It's a different kind of happiness. So the figure of the beach in that line links the concepts of day, which we could define as the present, the lived moment, and happiness. Now, to understand the concept of happiness, I have a little quote from the myth of Sisyphus. It's very short. It goes, all of Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. So in other words, a kind of an existence removed from God's, where we basically strive towards the end for no particular reason. But we have moments of awareness where we understand that it is all up to us, that our rock is our thing. The moments when the rock rolls down the hill, Camus talks about. These are the moments where we understand the absurdity of life and the attempt we make to put meaning into it. And when we understand that, we become one with the universe, which is indifferent to us. And that is our happiness. So when he's knocking on the door of misfortune, he's sort of putting himself into a world of rules and laws and court cases and all of those things. He's going to be judged by man. The absurd man can't be judged by anyone because there's no standards by which to judge us. So he's kind of, he's basically created a beginning and an ending. The perpetual present, that is, his happiness, is gone. That is held in the figure of the day. So that's kind of a, reasonably clumsy synopsis of the point of the novel. So it's kind of important that it's a beach where I'd been happy because it's figurative as well as literal. The beach is that space of the present. And then there's this question of knocking on the door of misfortune, because the particular word used can mean, Sandra Smith talks about this. The single word is malheur, and it has a wealth of associations: destiny, disaster, unhappiness, misfortune, accident, ordeal, mishap, and tragedy. So trying to get
a lot
all
of
that
meanings.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult. Now the Google Translate landed on misfortune, which is not. Misfortune doesn't capture the sense of tragedy and unhappiness. It's a slightly more fatalistic thing. So here we go. The translations. Stuart Gilbert, how did he go? I knew I'd shattered the balance of the day, the spacious calm of this beach on which I had been happy. And each successive shot was another loud, fateful rap on the door of my undoing. What do you think?
Oh, awful. But the door of my undoing, I think that's a keeper.
It's not a bad effort, actually. I like that. This beach, I think, is a mistake, but I do like my undoing. Laredo, I realized that I destroyed the balance of the day and the perfect silence of this beach where I'd been happy, which I think is a little better than the Gilbert. And it was like giving 4 sharp knocks at the door of unhappiness.
I don't think the door of unhappiness captures that French word that they're struggling with.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it captures a part of it, but it doesn't really quite work. I think the juxtaposition of happy and unhappy draws attention to something, but you need to understand that the beach is somewhat figurative. And I don't think that's clear in his version, so it collapses. Matthew Ward, I knew that I'd shattered the harmony of the day, the exceptional silence of a beach where I'd been happy. And it was like knocking 4 quick times on the door of unhappiness. So I think he actually makes that one important adjustment, a beach, that I think somewhat conveys what may have been the meaning of the original.
Yeah.
Sandra Smith, she's been doing very well late, like in this thing.
So. Oh, yeah, she has.
I realized that I had destroyed the natural balance of the day. That's really good. The exceptional silence of a beach where I'd once been happy. And it was as if I had rapped sharply 4 times on the fatal door of destiny. I think it should have been the fatal door of unhappiness, because fatal, of course, has the idea of tragedy and death, but it also has fate built into it. The fatal door of destiny feels a little bit redundant to me.
Yeah, but I don't like having the word happy and then unhappiness.
Yeah. I mean, because when I'm reading these
like
little
different
bits of
concepts.
Oh, they are? Well, yes and no. I mean, his particular meaning of happy and unhappy is very specific. It's a tough one, though, isn't it? And I wonder what French readers would have landed on. But that's obviously a very key scene in the book, the murder, which seems almost like an accident as he experiences it. And, you know, and again, time is bent in that. So the sun, the day he kills the Arab, and I say the Arab as in that is the character's name, the Arab, the sun is the same sun as when he buried his mother. And so we understand that it wasn't easy for him to be there burying his mother. The thing about Mousseau is people say Mousseau doesn't care about anything. He's a nihilist. Life is cheap. He didn't love his mother, etc. And that's not correct. He's just not connected to those feelings in a conscious way. And really, he becomes conscious in the final extract that I want to read. And this is the very end of the book. So if it hasn't been spoiled enough yet, here we go. Google Translate. I keep doing that. Google Translate. For the first time in a long time, I thought of Mum. It seemed to me that I understood why at the end of her life she had taken a fiancé, why she had played at starting over. Over there too, around this asylum where lives were extinguished, the evening was like a melancholy truce. So close to death, Mum must have felt liberated and ready to live it all again. No one had the right to cry over her. And I too felt ready to live it all again, as if this great anger had purged me of evil, emptied me of hope. Before this night full of signs and stars, I opened myself for the first time to the tender indifference of the world. To feel it so like me, so fraternal at last, I felt that I had been happy, and that I still was. For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone, I had to hope that there would be many spectators on the day of my execution, and that they would greet me with cries of hatred. So that's the ending of the book. And it has an echo from the myth of Sisyphus. And I'll just read you this quote quickly. The absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silences all the idols. In a universe suddenly restored to its silence, the myriad wondering little voices of the earth rise up. Unconscious secret calls, invitations from all the faces. They are the necessary reverse and price of victory. There is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night. I think shadow here is death, sun is life. And we see how the day, his present situation, he's living in the moment, not worrying about death. That's where it all ties together. And in the myth of Sisyphus, it's explained. Well, in a sense, it's good to read the two books together. I'll
have to do that because I haven't read Sisyphus.
Well, I don't want to give more spoilers, but I was going to say that for our next book after Cruddy, I did want to do A Happy Death and The Outsider, and the essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, not the whole book. Oh, which, just so you know, is like 220 pages altogether.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not bad. It's not bad at all. So the interesting points here are the evening was like a melancholy truce. I thought that was an interesting thing. And the tender indifference of the world. Because the absurd man is like the world, tenderly indifferent. And that's why he suddenly says to feel it so like me. And he realizes that he is like the world. Things don't have a meaning. There is nothing to specifically care about in the way we care about things in a sort of a judicial or sort of litigious way.
So what do you think on the two choices that Google Translate has made here? The melancholy truce.
The tender indifference, I think, is 100% right. That one's easy. The melancholy truce, I don't know. So he's in jail waiting to be executed. Although that is the choice that
Libretto made.
Yeah, he did. I don't know. I don't know that anyone... I'm not sure. So, I mean, well, Stuart Gilbert went, the dusk came as a mournful solace. Now, frankly, I don't think dusk and evening are quite the same thing. So, I mean, even just on that level, I'm not sure. A mournful solace suggests that there is some sort of care almost
which
in the dusk.
doesn't capture the point.
No, it's neutral. It's a truce. Laredo went for a kind of the evenings were a kind of melancholy truce. So he he's the closest to what we're going to call the literal translation. Matthew Ward said evening was a kind of wistful respite. I think the basic point is the same for me. I don't know what you think about that. And then Sandra Smith, evening offered a wistful moment of peace, which again I sort of feel is sort of more or less on point. I think maybe the thing about the truce is, though, that there is a sort of a fighting between the tenderly indifferent world and people living within it who are not indifferent, who care about the fact that people they love are dying in nursing homes, and that we are all going to die and we're all going to know the night. And so I think truce is probably closest from my point of view.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give it to Laredo myself. But then there's the other bit, the tender indifference of the world. I think that's 100% perfect, and Sandra Smith agrees, and that's exactly what she wrote, the tender indifference of the world. Matthew Ward wrote the gentle indifference of the world.
No.
Laredo, the benign indifference of the world, although actually it was originally gentle and they changed it later on. That was the one word that got changed in his translation some years later.
Interesting.
And Gilbert, the benign indifference of the universe, which universe and world are interchangeable in this context, but I just don't like it. I think it's very clear what the world is, and I think putting the universe in is odd.
If this was the Olympics and all of these translators were diving, Gilbert would have won he wouldn't even be standing on the podium.
No, it's really
Sorry,
interesting,
Gilbert.
and his translation was the only one for so long, and it was very much the canonical translation. Smith writes about how there's a paradoxical nuance in tender, sort of tender indifference. It's almost like the loving kiss of the whip. You know what I mean? It's that sort of idea.
And that's probably why I do prefer the word benign, because you don't have that juxtaposition with tender and indifference.
Oh, but it's meant
But
to
it
be
works.
there.
Yeah.
It's very much intended to be there. So I think for me, benign doesn't work because benign has no paradox built into it. And the whole concept of absurdism is sort of built on a paradox, in a sense that we, robbed of a sort of a God meaning, we find our own meaning. But it's not fixed in the stars, as it were. The sort of sense of happiness of being one with the universe is built into this idea of tender indifference. In that, So it's a fascinating book, and it's fascinating to look at the different translations and see how they're rendered. Because in Solaris, I think we came to the conclusion that it didn't matter that much.
Yeah.
But I feel like in this book,
because they are so short and Camus has dedicated so much time ripping out all the extra fluff, translation just suddenly changes. Now, every single twist of a word has such a huge impact on the meaning of this book, which you don't really get in Solaris. Well, I didn't experience that anyway with the two translations that we went through.
No, nor did I, which may be doing it an injustice, but I think with this book it's much more, there's so much more weight in each individual choice of word. So it's pretty interesting, isn't it? 5 translations, potentially, or I guess we could say 6 if you choose to read the book as filtered through Google Translate. Perhaps we never arrive at the outsider that Camus wrote at the time he wrote it, but I would say that by 1960, the year of his death, his sense of the book would have been very different to the sense he had of it in 1942 when it was published, or indeed when he was working on it in the 30s in the form of A Happy Death.
Do you know if once he finished The Outsider, he ever thought or started another version?
Not to my knowledge. And obviously A Happy Death was published 1972, I think it was, which was, like more than a decade after Camus had died. It was not his intention to publish it. The other interesting one was they also published a book called The First Man, and that was the book he was working on when he died, and he hadn't done his rigorous editorial process yet. So unlike all his other books, it's thick. And the style is very, it is fascinating. I told you this would be a fascinating week. It's just very interesting, this whole idea of translation. So I hope our listeners, will go away and read some interviews with translators if they don't already, see if they're on YouTube, in conversation, because, there's a lot going on. Meaning, which we all feel is an incredibly important thing, right? Meaning in our lives and our texts. Translators are like the priests and priestesses of meaning. And it's just a very fascinating thing.
I'm so grateful for all the translators, and I think part of the research that I did for the podcast, and it was looking into the compensation that is given for translators, and they don't ever get the credit that they deserve. They hardly ever appear on the cover of their translated works with the author, which I found very interesting. And according to PEN America, they get paid between 5 cents to 20 cents per word, and literary translators get paid less than commercial translators.
Yeah, that's rough. 5 cents a word is tough. 20 cents a word is perhaps not so terrible, but like Megan McDowell, I think you've got to be like powering through translation after translation. That lady's
to make it pay
prolific. Yeah.
And then, interestingly, I mean, this is changing. Recognition is starting to happen, but it's more the exception than the rule. But the International Booker Prize started sharing its prize money between the author and the translator equally, which apparently was a landmark decision that they made.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing. And I think most authors who've worked with translators closely, like Yoko Agawa and Stephen Snyder, for example, or Enrique and McDowell, they understand that their success in different markets and their artistic integrity, which the translators are essentially responsible for maintaining, they're massive things. And I think translation is absolutely a creative art form and should be better paid. I mean, although, in general, artistic pursuits are not well paid, are they? It's very difficult to monetize art unless you get a patron or a Patreon.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. We should set that up.
I wouldn't know how.
Well, I feel like you carried the weight of most of this podcast, so thank you, Gareth. That was incredibly fascinating. We'll have to pay Google Translate 20 cents per word for their amazing effort that they did today, recognizing Google Translate. We are reviewing Cruddy by Linda Barry next podcast. Halfway through, really excited. And I think, Gareth, you've alluded that we're going to be reviewing after Cruddy, The Outsider.
And a happy death.
And a happy death, and some essays. And we should read it in conjunction with Sisyphus.
Yeah, that'll be the essay. It's like 4 pages. But it's a good kind of way to see into the other 2 texts. So I would suggest to you that you read a bit of Sisyphus, then The Outsider, then A Happy Death. So sort of in reverse order. But I think that would be the way to get the most out of it.
Okay, well, I think that's it for today. Signing off. Hope you enjoyed the rest of a lovely weekend and week. Whenever you guys decide to sit down and listen to us, like and subscribe, and we'll see you all next time at the Pleasure of the Text.
See you, folks.